Rain fell like 1,000 whispered promises against the glass, blurring the world into shades of silver and shadow. A veteran with quiet limp stood in the doorway of a therapy center, watching a girl in a wheelchair clutch her sketchbook like a lifeline. Could hope take root here, between strangers bound only by chance? If you cherish stories of second chances and found family, subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Now, let's step on the mat and listen to this heartwarming story. Rain threaded down the wide glass doors of the Riverside Physical Therapy Center, each droplet catching the dull orange of the street lamp outside before sliding away into the night. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked wool, the kind of scent that settled into fabric and lingered past closing time. Rowan Callahan moved slowly across the open floor, adjusting a set of resistance bands on their wall hooks, his left leg carrying the faint rhythm of a limp. He worked without hurry, without waste. Every movement was deliberate, the way it always was when a day wound to its end. From the staff lounge to the far corner, Finn sat hunched over a sketchbook, a mechanical pencil ticking softly against the page. His hood was up against the draft from the hallway, but a few strands of light brown hair had fallen across his forehead. He wasn't drawing superheroes tonight, just a row of uneven rain puddles, each one rippling from the imagined drop of something just out of frame. The hum of rain on the roof was steady, a sound that seemed to settle everyone still inside the building. A couple of patients had already left under dripping umbrellas, their voices fading into the wet evening. The front door side opened again, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. A black SUV pulled right up to the curb. The door opened, and Lena Ray stepped out first, holding a broad black umbrella that shielded her from the waist up. Her coat, dark navy, perfectly fitted, glistened with rain along the shoulders. She moved to the passenger side and lowered the wheelchair ramp with practiced precision, her hand steady on the release lever. Sophie appeared in the glow of the overhead light, a small figure with long dark waves falling over her shoulders, a sketchbook clutched to her chest. The wheels of her chair bumped softly onto the ramp, and Lena guided her down without needing to look at the mechanism. There was an economy in the motion, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. From his chair in the lounge, Finn looked up, pencil frozen midline. The two locked eyes briefly through the glass, just enough for Sophie to notice, for Finn to register something he couldn't name. And then the connection broke when the automatic doors parted. Rowan was already near the reception desk, wiping his hands on a towel. "Evening," he said simply, his voice warm but measured. "Good evening," Lena replied, her tone polite, almost clipped. She turned her focus to Sophie's therapist, who was signing in with the receptionist. The therapist glanced toward the balanced platform in the center of the room, frowning at a slight tilt. "Rowan, could you give me a hand with that?" "Sure." He crossed the room, crouched beside the platform, and adjusted the base until the bubble in the level floated dead center. His movements were unhurried, confident. Finn had come out of the lounge without being noticed. He crouched beside his father, handed him a resistance band from the equipment bin without needing to be asked. Rowan gave him a small nod of thanks, the kind of acknowledgement that didn't interrupt the flow of the task. Sophie watched from her chair, sketchbook still balanced on her lap. Her fingers tapped against the cover, not in impatience but in some quiet rhythm of her own. "Ready?" the therapist asked her. Sophie nodded, and Rowan stepped back, leaving space. She wheeled herself forward under the therapist's guidance. For the next 30 minutes, the session moved in the slow, careful progression Rowan had seen 100 times with other patients. Stretch, pause, adjust, balance, rest, repeat. But there was something in the way Sophie's eyes tracked each instruction, in the way she absorbed the therapist's voice without glancing once toward her mother for confirmation. When the session ended, Lena helped her back toward the doors. The rain had thickened into a curtain now, the street beyond blurred and gleaming. Sophie reached to tuck her sketchbook into her bag. In that small miscalculation, it slid from her lap, landing with a muted splash in a shallow puddle just beyond the overhang. Rowan stepped forward before Lena could. He bent, lifted by the spine, careful to keep the pages from spreading. A single sheet had come loose inside, and his eyes caught on it. A pencil drawing of a girl standing on her own at the water's edge, waves curling at her bare feet. He didn't say a word. He slid the page back inside, closed the cover, and handed it to her. "Thanks," Sophie said softly. Before Rowan could answer, Finn spoke from behind him. "Cool drawing." Sophie looked at him as though deciding whether to accept the comment. Her lips pressed together, then curved, not quite into a smile, but close enough for Finn to notice. They left without more words, Lena maneuvering the chair down the ramp, umbrella tilted to shield both of them from the rain. The SUV's headlights caught on the glass doors as she glanced back once. Through the streak pane, Rowan was holding the door open for an elderly patient. Finn beside him, one hand braced on the metal push bar. The reflection in the glass distorted them slightly, rain making them ripple and shift like figures in water. Lena turned away, stepping into the waiting warmth of the car, but the image stayed with her, two silhouettes framed in yellow light, standing quietly against the press of the rain. The rain had a way of making the city seem smaller, folding the edges until all that was left were pockets of light and the soft percussion of water on glass. Riverside Physical Therapy was one of those pockets. On certain afternoons, when the parking lot shimmered under a thin sheet of runoff and the gutters gurgled like small streams, Lena would pull the SUV into her usual space, glance at Sophie in the rearview mirror, and see something close to anticipation there. Not excitement exactly, but expectation. It wasn't long before their appointments began to align with Rowan's shifts. Sophie noticed it first, though she never said so outright. Finn was always there in the waiting area, sometimes sprawled in one of the worn armchairs with a book, other times kneeling on a low mat beside her chair, showing her how to do tricks with a deck of cards. She would study the way his hands moved, nimble and sure, and find herself trying to mimic the shuffle later at home. Rowan didn't intrude on these moments. He moved around the open floor, swapping out therapy bands, wiping down rails, checking the balance beams for stability. Yet there was an ease in the way his gaze would drift toward them, as if he was keeping time without being obvious. One late afternoon, the rain was coming down so hard it blurred the outlines of the buildings across the street. Sophie's therapist was running behind, caught in traffic. Rowan crouched beside Sophie's chair, adjusting the footrests. "We could start with some stretches, if you like," he said. Sophie tilted her head, searching his face for a trace of condescension, but found none. "All right." Finn appeared with a rolled yoga mat under one arm. "You like this one?" he told her as he set it down. "It's easy, but it looks hard." They worked in the quiet rhythm of people concentrating on small, precise things. Rowan guided her through ankle rotations and seated twists, careful not to overreach for her, always let her decide when to push and when to pause. Finn knelt opposite her, mirroring the movements for no reason other than to make her grin. At one point she asked, almost offhand, "Were you always good at standing?" The question landed heavier than she might have intended. Rowan's hand stilled on the mat. "No," he said, and the rain steadied as filled the space between his words. "I had to learn again after an injury. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy." Finn looked up at his father, something sparking in his expression. He had never heard it said like that, never with the quiet weight of truth. Lena had been standing near the doorway, flipping through her phone, but now she lowered it. She studied Rowan with a narrowed gaze, as though trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the version she had assumed. The therapist arrived then, apologetic, and the session began in earnest. Rowan stepped back, returned to his tasks, but the air felt altered somehow. Later that week, during another rain-slick evening, Sophie spotted something on the corner of a low shelf in the staff room, a small, neatly folded patch, dark fabric with an embroidered trident. She turned it over in her hands, curious. Finn appeared at her side. "That's Dad's," he said, as if it needed no further explanation. "It's from when he had to do something impossible." Sophie didn't ask what that was. She didn't need to. The word impossible had a way of embedding itself without details. By the third week of these overlapping sessions, Lena began to notice something she couldn't quite ignore. Sophie left therapy lighter. Not physically, not yet, but in some intangible way that showed in her posture and the way she held her head. And Finn, always ready with a joke or a quick sketch in her notebook, had become an unplanned fixture in those afternoons. One session ended early because a piece of equipment malfunctioned. As Lena gathered Sophie's things, She realized the rain had picked up again, sweeping across the lot in long, slanted lines. Rowan stepped forward without a word, holding the therapy center's spare umbrella over Sophie while Finn wheeled her toward the SUV. The four of them moved together, their pace matched by the steady beat of the rain. Finn angled the chair just so to avoid a deep puddle near the curb. Sophie glanced at him, murmured a quiet thanks, and he answered with a quick grin. When Sophie was settled, Lena lingered a moment under the umbrella. "I appreciate you stepping in today," she said, her tone softer than before. "Not a problem," Rowan replied. His voice was calm, unassuming, as if the gesture had been nothing at all. Ahead of them, Finn and Sophie were already talking. Something about favorite animals, their voices nearly lost in the rain's constant hush. Lena watched them for a second longer than necessary before closing the SUV door. As she drove away, she caught their reflection in the side mirror. Two figures under the therapy center's awning, one taller, one smaller, both framed by the gentle shimmer of water streaming off the roof. It was a simple image, but it carried with it the sense that something, however slight, had begun to shift. The rain never really stopped that month. Some days it came in a light, steady mist that clung to everything like breath on glass. Other days arrived in sweeping downpours that turned the streets into rivers. By now, Sophie had grown accustomed to the way the world looked from the therapy center's windows. Blurred outlines of cars, the shimmer of wet pavement, pedestrians moving like shadows behind umbrellas. And always, somewhere nearby, Rowan and Finn. Their presence had become part of the routine, as unspoken as the order in which Sophie's therapist adjusted the balance rails or the way Lena hung her coat on the same hook by the door. Rowan no longer waited for instructions before helping Mara set up equipment. Finn no longer lingered in the waiting area, but found his way to Sophie's side before each session began. It started with the notes. One rainy afternoon, Sophie opened her sketchbook to find a small square of lined paper tucked between two of her drawings. In Rowan's careful, blocky handwriting, it read, "One more step than yesterday." She didn't mention it to anyone. She just left a note where it was, a silent marker she could touch with her fingers before each appointment. The next week, there was another, steady as the rain. That one had a tiny doodle in the corner, a stick figure holding an umbrella, drawn in Finn's looser, more playful style. Sophie traced the drawing with her fingertip, an almost smile tugging at her mouth. When she entered the center that day, Finn was already on the mat, practicing a simple kata. "Want to learn one you can do sitting down?" he asked. "I guess," she said, but her voice was lighter than usual. He showed her the sequence, slow, deliberate movements of the arms, each one flowing into the next. Rowan stood nearby, watching without interrupting, his hands resting on the back of a chair. Lena, who had just finished a phone call, paused to watch too. For a moment, the whole room seemed to narrow around the rhythm of those motions, the steady breathing, the rain tapping its own pattern against the windows. Later, when Sophie managed to stand between the parallel bars for 15 full seconds, Finn counted each one aloud in mock suspense. 12, 13, 14, and he clapped his hands together just as her knees wobbled and she caught herself. The sound startled Lena, and she found herself smiling before she could stop it. "Well done," she said softly, though whether she meant Sophie or Finn, she couldn't quite tell. As they took a break, Lena crossed to where Rowan was straightening resistance bands. "He's patient with her," she said quietly. "He knows what it's like to need more time," Rowan replied. He didn't look at her when he said it, but his voice carried a weight that made her think of the story Sophie had told her, how Rowan had learned to stand again after his injury. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Finn and Sophie's friendship deepened in small, unremarkable ways, sharing sketches, swapping bad jokes, leaning toward each other when they spoke. She taught him how to draw hands in proper proportion. He taught her how to flick a pencil into the air and catch it again. Sometimes, Rowan would join in with quiet encouragement, and sometimes Lena would stand at a distance, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, watching it all without admitting to herself how much it moved her. The turning point came on an afternoon when the rain was falling hard enough to rattle the roof. Sophie's therapist had stepped away to grab a fresh progress chart, leaving Rowan to stand at the end of the parallel bars while Sophie positioned herself between them. Finn knelt at her side, offering the same encouragement he always did. But this time she didn't wait for permission. She took one step, then another, and a third, each one small, shaky, but real. Finn's cheer broke through the rain's constant percussion. "Yes!" he shouted, the sound filling the room before he could think to lower his voice. Lena's hand flew to her mouth. Rowan met her eyes across the space between them, not smiling, but holding her gaze steady, as if to anchor her to the moment. Sophie gripped the bar again, breathless but grinning. "Told you I could," she said to Finn. "You did," he answered, his voice softer now, carrying something that wasn't just pride but relief. When the session ended, Sophie lingered on the mat, flipping through her sketchbook. She tore out a page and handed it to Rowan without explanation. The drawing showed 3 figures, 2 tall, 1 smaller, walking together beneath 3 umbrellas. The proportions were slightly off, the lines smudged in places, but the intent was clear. Finn pretended to busy himself with packing up his bag, but Rowan caught the brief upward curve of his mouth. Lena, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in her chest. Not a leap, not a flood, but the quiet till of the bridge beginning to span a gap. Outside, the rain still fell, steady and sure, as if it had been waiting all along for the right moment to matter. The rain came hard that afternoon, drumming on the roof of Riverside Physical Therapy in a deep, steady rhythm that seemed to press the world inward. The glass doors were a blur of silver streaks and soft reflections. The street outside was a restless mirror. Inside, the air was warmer than usual, thick with the scent of wet coats and the faint medicinal tang of antiseptic. Lena stood near the coat rack, shaking the last droplets from her umbrella, while Sophie wheeled herself toward the mat where Rowan was finishing up with another patient. Finn was already there, cross-legged on the floor, idly sketching the corner of Sophie's notebook. When she rolled up beside him, he grinned and tilted the page so she could see. It was a rough cartoon of her in rain boots, standing upright, arms out as if testing her balance. Sophie studied it for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the page. Rowan stepped over. His hair, damp with the hood of his jacket, had slipped back. "Mara's running a little behind," he said, glancing at Lena. "We've got the space if you want to work on something." Lena hesitated, eyes flicking towards Sophie. "If she's up for it." "I am," Sophie said quickly, her voice steady enough to make Lena take a half step back and let the decision stand. Rowan positioned the parallel bars in their usual spot, but Finn shook his head. "No bars this time. Let's make it interesting." Sophie turned to him, narrowing her eyes. "Interesting how?" He held up her sketchbook like a prize. "Walk to me. You get this back when you do." His tone was teasing, but the look he gave her wasn't. Lena opened her mouth to object, then stopped when she saw the way Rowan was watching Sophie. Not pushing, not doubting, simply present. The rain against the window seemed to grow louder in the pause. Sophie shifted forward in her chair, hands gripping the armrests. Rowan moved to her side, close enough to catch her as she faltered, but not close enough to make it easy. She placed her feet carefully on the mat, braced herself, and rose. Her knees trembled almost immediately, but she steadied them, drawing in a slow breath. Finn crouched at the far end of the mat, holding the sketchbook against his chest, his grin replaced by something quieter, more intent. One step. The mat cushioned the sound of it, but the effort rang clear in the set of her jaw. Another step. Her balance wavered. Rowan's hand lifted instinctively, but didn't touch. The third step was harder, her foot catching slightly on the rubber surface, but she recovered, pushing forward. The rain beat a quicker tempo against the glass now, as if it too were holding its breath. By the time she reached him, Finn had risen to his knees. She swayed, caught herself, and thrust a hand toward him. He clasped it, pulling her the last few inches into a clumsy but undeniable stand in front of him. "Told you," she said, breathless. "You did," he murmured, placing the sketchbook in her hands. Lena was already moving forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She crouched beside her daughter, one arm curling around her shoulders, her forehead resting briefly against Sophie's temple. She didn't speak. The silence was more eloquent than anything she might have said. Rowan stepped back, giving them space. He found himself watching Finn instead, The way the boy's expression had shifted from triumph to something softer, almost protective. When Finn glanced up, their eyes met, and Rowan gave a small nod that was returned in kind. The moment passed, but its shape lingered. The rest of the session was spent in lighter work, stretches and seated movements, but the air in the room had changed. Even the sound of the rain felt different, less a barrier and more of a backdrop. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began walking short distances daily, across the living room at home, from the car to the therapy mat, without pausing halfway. Finn often met her at the door of the center, carrying her sketchbook or some new drawing he'd made. Rowan noticed how Lena's guard had softened, her conversations with him stretching beyond the polite exchanges of before. One morning, the rain was gentle, more of a mist than a storm. Rowan was locking the supply cabinet when Lena approached, Sophie and Finn ahead of them on the walkway. Sophie was walking, slow, careful, but walking, while Finn matched his pace to hers. Lena stopped beside him, watching the two children. "You gave her something I couldn't," she said. Rowan shook his head. She already had it. She just needed to see it. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lena's hand slid into his, not tentative, but deliberate. Later that afternoon, when the last appointment had ended in the rain and started again in earnest, Rowan found Sophie's sketchbook on the bench by the wall. He flipped it open to the last page. Her figure stood under a single wide umbrella. 2 adults, 2 children, all walking in step. At the bottom, in neat, deliberate letters, she had written one word: family. He closed the book gently, the sound of the rain filling the quiet room. If this story touched, subscribe and share where you are listening from.